Well, hello everyone. My name is Garrett Sammons. I am a creative director and filmmaker for a company called Nice Shirt Media. So today is going to be the first in a series of lighting webinars that we're going to be doing together that I'll be hosting, in which we're going to be talking about kind of industry standard tips and tricks when it comes to lighting and things that I have learned along the way. This will be kind of a two-part thing where we're going to be talking about creative strategies and how we approach lighting. And in addition to that, of course, how we can use certain types of fixtures to achieve certain looks. So for today, we are going to be looking at interview lighting. As filmmakers, we do interviews constantly, whether it's for documentary work or commercial work or any other kind of corporate work. It is a toolkit that we or a tool that we need to have in our toolkit for understanding how to light people in a way that's attractive. So again, this is going to be the first in a series that we do together. If at any point in time throughout this session or any of the future sessions that we have this year, if you have any questions, please, we have a Q&A module here in the Zoom, as well as a chat. So either way, if you have questions as we go through this, I will be more than happy to answer those questions as we go along, or of course, again, at the end. So before we dive in today, I want to first kind of show you guys what we're going to be looking at lighting, and then of course talk about how we approach that. So let's take a look at this here. Okay, so apparently, can you guys hear me? Was it just that didn't have sound? Are you guys able to hear me just fine? Okay, perfect, wonderful, just that. All right, apologies on that guy here, but we're going to be talking again today about interviews. Now, before we can talk about how we light interviews, we first need to talk about how we approach interviews, because of course, how we set up our lights and how we set up our camera is entirely dependent on the location in which we are filming. So for this particular setup that we're going to be looking at today and breaking down, we wanted to film in a theater and having kind of a theater environment. And that's very particular and very specific why we intended it to do that way. So when we're filming interviews, one of the first things that we need to think about is how the environment that we're filming in affects the story that we're telling. Especially pretty early on in a lot of filmmakers' careers, when you guys are getting work, doing corporate or documentary work stuff, most of the time, clients or people want to kind of cram you into like a conference room, right? Or a small space of some kind that is going to be too tiny to do any real lighting, and the location isn't going to serve the story. So the first thing, anytime you set up an interview, is to make sure that the location that you are doing the filming in contributes to the narrative in the story that you are telling. This is one of those things that, like, having a location scout is super important to be a part of. A location scout is where you would go to wherever you're going to be filming ahead of time, walk through that space, and then use that time to determine where you want those interviews to be set up. If you just wait until on the day, that's where we get crammed into small spaces, and those aren't going to be the best in terms of helping our narrative for whatever the thing is that we're going to be filming. Which leads to the second point when we're talking about how we approach these things. The larger the environment you're in, the better it will be for your story. This is where we can add depth. This is where we can have detail. This is where we can, again, use those surroundings to help tell our narrative. So don't settle for conference rooms. Don't settle for small spaces. Really lean into finding large environments that service whatever the narrative is that you're going for. And that can be off-site too. A lot of places will want you to be kind of in their space or in their location, but there might be other spaces that make more sense. So that before we even set up a single light, that's what we need to do. And in the same way with our locations, the other piece that's super important is to make sure that we're lighting in a way that also services the story, right? It's not just about being in a place and then just setting up lights and moving on and being done with it. It's really about using the way that we light to tell this story. So for today, we're going to be looking at the setup that we did together here. Let me see if I can get this guy to turn on. And that setup is, of course, us shooting in this theater, which was kind of on the last frame of that piece that we looked at here at the top, which even though there was no audio, it is still this. So let me show you guys a still frame from this real quick here. So if we come over here, can you guys see this? Okay. So if we look at this still frame, we're filming this in a theater. So the idea of this interview is we have kind of this model here who looks similar to a Lin-Manuel Miranda-esque character, and we have put them on the stage, and behind them we have this theater seating. So in this hypothetical setup, of course, this isn't an actual interview for a project, this is this lighting tutorial. But for this, if having our character have something to do with the theater or with stage or with, live production, putting them in a location that makes sense for that is important. Hence us filming this character in a theater environment. The next piece, though, is of course how we choose to light it. Now, in a theater environment, there are kind of two sets of lights. There are the stage lights and the house lights. And we wanted to lean on that in the way that we showed this. So when approaching lighting interviews, the first thing that we should talk about is how to light our environment or our background light. Because it's not just enough to light the person. Again, we need to treat this way. And so for this, what we ended up doing is we used a Gemini 2x1 soft. And this is a large fixture, again, 2 foot by 1 foot. And we were able to, because everything is on the fixture, set it up really high with barn doors around it to kind of shape the light. And we put it on a combo stand, put it about 15 feet in the air, and just ever so slightly pointed it down into the seating behind our subject. Again, not enough to really light the space because we wanted it, again, to feel like the house lights would be dimmed down while the stage lights, where our subject is turned on. And the nice thing with all of the Gemini fixtures, but this one included, is of course, not only do we have full dimming control, but we also have full CCT control, meaning that we can adjust the Kelvin value of that light to be whatever it is that we want. So we were able to take the CCT value of that light, or the Kelvin value of that light, and make it super, super warm in the way that a tungsten light would be when it's dimmed really down low, about 25 to 2700 Kelvin, and then use that to just barely illuminate to give context to our background. Now, of course, this is kind of an extreme example because what we're talking about is lighting for a stage. But even if you're in a corporate environment, thinking about how you illuminate or how you light your background gives placement to our subject. A couple of questions have come in here. Thoughts about lighting the background versus lighting the subject, how to balance both without going completely black. That is super important. So of course, every camera has a contrast ratio or a dynamic range of what that camera is capable of recording, from highlights to shadows. And making sure that we're living within the limitations of whatever that camera is that you're using is how we would find that balance. And you can do that by using false color in a camera. It's a great way of understanding exposure values. If you don't have false color in your monitors, you could even use things like histograms, waveforms, zebra stripes, but just making sure that we're living within that contrast ratio. When I light an environment, I always light the background first, because especially with the lights that we're using here, these Litepanels Gemini lights, I have a lot of latitude with how much I can blast through this stuff. So by setting my background the way that I want and then lighting my foreground, I can then match those contrast ratios in a way that makes sense. So then that way, of course, our backgrounds aren't super blown out either in the highlights or in the shadows. So I start with the background and work my way forward. You don't have to do it that way, but especially in certain environments where you don't have a lot of control, like if you have huge windows and things like that, making sure that we can adjust that background environment to then place our person in is how I approach it. Okay, so somebody asked about the Gemini versus the Sky panel. I'm going to let the Litepanels team answer that question. I don't have the exact metrics on it, but they are super comparable. Having used both regularly, I don't notice a huge difference in terms of output difference, but again, I'm going to let the Litepanels team handle that. Okay, so what camera are you guys using in this situation? And at what f-stop are you shooting? That's a great question. So for most interview stuff, and this is true of narrative work and docu-style work, in terms of camera, we usually will have our f-stop around 4, 5, 6, kind of in that range. If we get more shallow than that, as subjects move throughout their interview, they're going to go soft in one way or another, and I'm not going to have a first AC to pull focus or track focus with them. So being somewhere between like an f4 and an f5.6 generally is going to give me enough of a depth of field that as people kind of adjust and move through the interview, I'm not going to lose them completely. So for what you guys just watched there, that was shot on the red Komodo, which has a dynamic range latitude. I mean, it says it has a lot more, but it has a dynamic range latitude of about 13 stops, which is plenty for most things. But that's how we had that camera set up for that one. So another question, how much spill was there from the subject lights into the background? That's a great question, and we're going to get into that here in just a second as we kind of talk and expand out a little bit more. But again, this is one of the reasons why having distance or having a big space to work in is so much better for interviews, because of course, the more depth we have within our space, the more forgiving our lighting can be from foreground to background. Whereas if everything's super, super tight, we're going to run into some issues there. Again, we'll talk about the butterfly here in just a second, Armand, so don't worry. Give me just a second here. So that's the background light. That was the first thing, was this 2x1 Gemini light that's illuminating the background. We're going to get into the big frame here in just a second here. But before we do, the next light that I want to talk about, wait for it here, is what we would call our hair light. This light has a lot of names: hair light, backlight, cut light, edge light. There's a lot of different names for this light, but essentially we just call it a hair light or a backlight. And the purpose of that light is to separate my foreground from my background. And we do that a couple of ways. But for this one, what we used is we used a 1x1 Gemini soft, and we put it into a softbox. I didn't put any front diffusion on it. All I put was I put a 40-degree egg crate right on the front of it, just again to eliminate spill from my foreground to my background. You can see the egg crate there. And the nice thing with the 1x1 fixtures is that they're so light that I can fly them up on a booming combo stand and not need a menace arm or a lot more rigging like you would if you had a much heavier fixture. So with this light, I was able to get it up and over from behind my subject and use that as what we would consider to be a stage light. Again, using lights as a storytelling tool, right? We want the background to feel like the house lights. We want our subject to feel like they're on the stage lights. So for this, we used a very bright backlight, which you can see here, and see how the shadows are coming up and across, but not really affecting my background all that much because of that egg crate. And in the same way with the 2x1, with this 1x1, we also adjusted that CCT value to be a really warm tungsten style light, and then can adjust, the intensity as needed. This is a very extreme example of a background light, of using a super bright light to separate my foreground from my background. Generally, depending, of course, on how your narrative or your story dictates, you don't need to use that bright of a backlight. Hair lights generally just need to be bright enough to add a little bit of a rim across your subject like this, but not so much so that it draws attention to itself. But again, everything in our lighting is dictated by the story, and I wanted this to feel like a very intense, bright spotlight coming down on them as if they were on the stage. So background lights first, make sure that we have that kind of set up in the way that we want. Then we have our hair light to separate our foreground from our background. A couple more questions here. Let's see. For static interviews, do you set up your camera on a tripod and let it roll? Yeah, so for this setup here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, it's a 2-camera setup. So we have the head-on camera with our subject looking into the lens, and then we have kind of what we would call the 45, right? So we have those two, and that's a pretty standard setup for most interviews. And generally, yes, I will lock off interviews, especially if we're going to be oversampling or over-resolution shooting. So most of the deliverables that we work with are still in kind of a full HD 1080 standard. But of course, if we're working with cameras that film in higher resolutions, we can then add a little bit of drift, a little bit of push, pull, zoom, that kind of stuff in post. I don't lean on a lot of reframing in post, but it is something you can do. Now, if you have a team that, with multiple camera ops and things like that, of course, your camera movement, like your lighting, should be dictated by the story. So if you have float, that's fine. If you're working kind of with like an ENG style where you've got people with shoulder rigs, totally cool. But that's all dictated by the story. So it's not like you should only shoot it on shoulder rigs or you should only shoot it tripod. That's just entirely dependent on who you're talking to and what it is that they're saying. What's the best background ratio in terms of stops from your talent for inside setups? That's a great question. So again, also very determined by the camera that you're using. A lot of mirrorless or DSLR cameras don't have the same latitude, which means that you're not going to be able to get as extreme of contrast ratios between your foreground and your background. Obviously, for a camera that can shoot in RAW or some sort of compressed RAW, like a ProRes RAW or that type of thing, you've got to have a lot more latitude to pull from. But in general, I would like to have it about to be 1.5 to 2 stops different. But again, with this, obviously, we're talking about something that's like close to 5 stops different between my talent and the background, because again, it's just dependent on how we go about telling the story and the stories that we choose to tell. So again, lighting dictates everything, but for this, it's a much more extreme example than what we would normally see in kind of a standard interview setup. So that was our background light, and then we have our hair light or backlight. The next light, and then this gets into this big frame here, is our key light. Now, before we talk about the specific fixture that we're using here for this, there is a concept that a lot of folks, when they're starting out, don't fully understand. And that is how light behaves, the behavior of light. And when we talk about that, we're talking about kind of hardness to softness, right? Is entirely determined by the relative surface area of the light compared to your subject, right? So think about it this way. On a bright sunny day, the sun, while is a giant source of light, is so far away that in the sky it looks super tiny. And so by having a relatively small surface area of a light in comparison to us, our subjects, the shadows are super hard, right? Whereas on a cloudy day, right, you're taking that surface area and you're scattering it across the entire sky. Now you have a much larger surface area, which makes things a lot softer. People, humans, generally tend to look better in soft light than hard light, which means that we need to increase the surface area of whatever the fixtures are that we're using to get that light to behave in the way that we want. Now, you don't need a frame as big as the one that we're going to be looking at here, but it is important that when we're lighting people, we focus on making sure that we have large surface areas over our fixtures so that we get nice, soft light. Let's see here. So we got a couple more here. Having access to theater lights is probably with tungsten. I would have used them as they are continuous radiator to do full spectrum than spiky LED fixtures relying on overlapping narrow. Okay, so Brad brings up an interesting question, and of course this is the difference in fixtural behavior. So yes, we were in a space that had house lights. We didn't have any access to those house lights. No stage managers were on hand, so we didn't have to worry about that. there. Now, the other thing that's really nice with these particular LED fixtures, and we're talking about the Geminis from Litepanels, is that you have not only daylight to tungsten full spectrum CCT control, but you also have offset, which is going to be your tint, right? So that's magenta to green. And you also have 2 full sets of Lee style gels. So you're going to have an entire gel library, and you can get those to behave in that same way and match that with your tungsten fixtures or with your daylight fixtures, depending. So when I work with these fixtures, I always have a spectrometer and a light meter and all that on me. And the color rendition that I get out of these lights is actually quite incredible. And especially because, of course, they're super lightweight, they don't get hot and all of that other stuff. So Brad, you bring up a great point in terms of the difference between fixtures. In this case, of course, we don't have house light control, much less positioning control and that kind of thing. So having that control built into the Litepanels fixtures really helps bridge that gap here. Okay, Syed says, as you mentioned, it varies from scene to scene. Maybe scene is depressing and you're using darks. Do you use all the basic lighting, key light, filler, and face light? Okay, so Syed, yes. Great question. So early on, especially in film school and stuff, you will learn about 3-point lighting. You do not need to use 3 fixtures to map that out to make that happen every time. For 3-point lighting, it's much more about the principles behind what those are, more so than it is about using those fixtures. And the reason why we talk about 3-point lighting, especially in an interview setup like this, is because the principles behind that are what make people look the most attractive, right? So key light, our main source of illumination, our fill light to remove any unwanted or unflattering shadows, and then your backlight or hair light to separate your foreground from the background. You don't need independent fixtures for all those, but you need to make sure that your background and foreground have separation, that you do have a main source of illumination, and that people don't look ugly, right? We don't have unattractive shadows, and we make them look as good as possible. So story is always going to dictate how we light or how extreme we light or how we make people look and feel. But that's the reason why we use those principles, is because we want people to look as attractive as possible. Hannah asks, how can we white color matching when we're in need of different brands from a spectral point of view? Yeah, so this is a key piece here. So when we're talking about color accuracy, right, because that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about spectrometers and stuff like that, we want to have lights that we can rely on to give us the color output and the color variables that we have plugged in. So I have a spectrometer and I have a light meter. Those are things that I use to get my contrast, to understand my exposure, and of course to understand my color accuracy. I have been using these Litepanel lights now for the better part of 5 years, and I can say with full confidence, I actually don't need my spectrometer when I am using these. What I will do is, if I'm using other lights, right, whether they're tungsten lights or other LED fixtures or things, I will get reads on those fixtures and then plug those reads into the Gemini. And I have not had any issue with them being able to match identically to other fixtures that I use. But the way that I would do that is I would get the reads off of whatever those fixtures are and then plug those into the Gemini, knowing that it's going to then be able to get those accurately. What do you suggest in terms of lighting wattage, using higher and putting filters, or using the approved watt lights? So we're talking about actual bulbs in fixtures. I would never overcrank the wattage of a bulb in a particular fixture. That said, with these, because they're LED panels, you don't really have to worry about that because that's always in there. One of the things that I tell my film students is I tell them, whatever your budget is, buy the brightest, most accurate fixture you can. Because anytime we modify a light, we're either going to be losing stops of light, so the intensity is going to go down, or the spread of light. In some cases, both. So if we have a super bright light that we can adjust, that means that when we modify it, we're not losing so much that then it becomes unusable. If you get a light that isn't that bright, it's going to limit the amount that you can modify it, which is going to limit the use cases that you can have for that light. So the brightest, most accurate light you can. And that is actually going to take us to the key light, and then I'll get to a couple of these here in just a second. The key light that we used for this setup is the Gemini 1x1 Hard. This is the newest fixture by Litepanels, and like the name implies, it is a 1x1 LED panel, but it is 5 times the brightness and intensity of the 1x1 soft. And here you can see we're actually even using it in a dual array. So you can get a dual array bracket, which allows you to take 2 fixtures, mount them side by side, and treat them as a single fixture. And then here you can see that we're blasting this through what is called a 12x12 butterfly. This 12x12 butterfly has an artificial silk on it, which is about a stop to a stop and a half of diffusion that's on it. But by blasting both of those lights through that fixture and putting that about 8 feet away from my subject, as you can see here, gives a very bright light, but it is still an attractive light. It is still a soft light. It still has really good wrap. And the fixture is so bright that it also allows us to have catch lights in the eyes, right? People look most alive when you get some light reflection in the eyeballs. And this light is so bright, but through a 12x12 frame is so soft that I can get the intensity that I want without it getting really harsh and streaky across the face. And to the question earlier about that particular frame, that's what is called a fold-away frame. So that frame actually collapses down into a 6 foot by about that big a round frame that then just expands out when you're on set. So it's actually quite easy to travel with. And then you just put it on your standard stands, whether they're combo stands or light stands, and you're able to then use that in that way. You do not have to use a modifier that is that big. And for most things, a 12 by is going to be pretty aggressive. But because we're on this big stage and we have all of this space, I could back the lights up by having large modifiers and still get the light behavior that I want. And this goes back to kind of doing a 2 camera setup versus a 1 camera setup. With a 1 camera setup, I have my camera, I have my subject, and then I can bring everything in as close as I possibly can without getting it into frame. But anytime you add multiple cameras, right? And depending on the importance of the interview, you might have 3, 4, 5 cameras. Anytime you add a new angle, that is an area now that you can't have lights because we don't want those in the frame. So by having super bright, super accurate lights allows me to back all of those lights up and still get the behavior out of those lights that I want. This is why we use the 12x12 grid. We backed it up far enough that it's not catching in either of the cameras, but it's still behaving in the way that I want. Same with the 1x1 that we put on the booming combo up overhead and behind. I was able to get the stand far enough away because the fixture is so light that I was then able to get it up and over and still not catch it in either one of my frames. Okay, so let's see here. Personally, I've found that Litepanels lights are way better for lighting faces with diffusion than Cobb style LEDs. Yeah, okay, so in terms of LED fixtures, we generally have kind of 2 camps. There are a couple others, but it falls primarily under panel lights or to Cobb style, Fresnel style LED lights. Tube lights have become quite popular as of late, which look like the fluorescent tubes, but they've got LEDs in them, and they all behave a little differently. But yes, when filming people, the Fresnel style or the Cobb style LED lights have a very, very, very small and intense LED chip. And because of that surface area being so small, we have to modify those a great deal so that way we don't get spotty, very small surface areas within our lights. So if I was using a Cobb style or a Fresnel style LED light, a beauty dish would be a modifier that you'd use for that, but you're losing so much light in terms of stops using something like that, that using a panel light with modifiers, but you can use it with much lighter modifiers, gives you way more versatility when it comes to lighting people than you would necessarily with, you know, a Fresnel style fixture. So you're absolutely right on that. So Mark, the name of that frame it's from a company called Avenger, and that is a 12x12. It's called a fold-away butterfly frame. And that's so it collapses down into kind of one solid thing, and then it's easy to travel with. So there you go. So Mark says, what diffuse? Okay, all right. Thoughts on different types of diffusion. So yeah, there are a lot of different diffusions that you can use. So the one that we used on that frame is what would be called an artificial silk. There are a lot of other kinds that you can use that all behave a little bit differently. Things like magic cloth are going to be very different than an artificial silk. The artificial silk is going to be one of the heavier diffusions, which is going to be a lot thicker, and you're going to lose more light, but the light is going to be scattered much more beautifully, in my opinion, than something like a magic cloth. And for this, because the 1x1 Gemini lights are the hards are so unbelievably bright, and we were using two of them in a dual array, we had so much light to play with that losing a stop and a half off of an artificial silk is not that big of a deal. We still got the behavior that we wanted out of that. Steve said, let's see here, is this the same size as the IntelliTech Fast Frame 5x6.5? I don't know. The name would make me think that that one is going to be smaller because this is a 12x12 frame. But again, you can get them in 4 foot. You can get them in 6 foot, 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot. You can kind of get them in a wide range of stuff. So personally, I have a 4 foot, an 8 foot, and a 12 foot. Depending on the environment I'm in, will depend on which one I'm bringing onto set there. What are the diffusion materials that would lose the least amount of stops of light? So that's when you'd start getting into things like scrims. Scrims are going to be like screens where they're not going to necessarily change the behavior of the light as much as they are just going to kind of scatter it and drop it down a stop or two. Or like you can go from quarter stop to half stop to full stop and so on and so forth. But with diffusion, generally you're going to be running into magic cloth, or you're going to be running into artificial silks. Those are going to be probably the two most popular. Magic cloth is going to have less light loss than an artificial silk. But again, it's not going to change the behavior quite as much. That actually does bring up a good point, which is going to be our next lighting piece here, which goes into the idea of 3-point lighting doesn't always have to be a fixture, and that is our fill. And in this particular case, our fill light isn't even a light at all. What we use here is what we would call a beadboard. This is a 4 foot by 8 foot panel that you can then mount on a C-stand and rotate and things. And all it does is redirect light, right? Bounce light. And because the purpose of a fill is just to remove unwanted shadows or unattractive shadows, we're not trying to lose contrast. We still want all of that beautiful contrast. We just want to fill in any gaps where there might be something that's too dark across the face. And like with our key light, the surface area matters. So having a 4 foot by 8 foot beadboard is enough surface area that I don't have to bring it super close into my subject. And you can see here, as I rotate that in, how it fills in just a little bit to give me a little bit less contrast across that face. Now, just like with diffusion, there is a ton of options that you have in terms of bounce. So you have ultra bounce, you have muslin, you have beadboard, you have white cord. There's probably 15 of them, and they all behave a little differently. But a nice trick that you can do is you can go to a big box store and you can get insulation panels. They're also called Polypro. Polypro is like, I don't know, $10 to $15 for a 4x8 board, compared to if you were to buy real beadboard, which is going to cost you like $300 to $400 for that same size. So I use polyboard all the time whenever I need to have some sort of beadboard. And the reason why we call it beadboard, by the way, is that the front is stippled. There's all these little styrofoam kind of beads, and it helps refract the light in a bunch of different ways. So then that way it's not singularly directional, where it kind of scatters it across, and again, works really well as a fill. So by using a fill light, not as a light fixture, but just redirecting the insane amount of light that we had coming off of that key, allows us to get that same idea of what a fill light would do without the need for another light fixture. So let's see here. Where's your backlight in this setup, Garrett? So the backlight, we actually put it in two different places. We started by having it on what would be stage left or audience right, and putting it up and over. But what we realized is that the shadows that it was casting across the seats were going in the wrong direction from what we wanted. So then we actually moved it onto stage right, audience left. Yes, over here. And then we put it that way because then the shadows were kind of going across the frame into where we had our lead room for our talent. So then, we were able to kind of get that separation that way. Somebody asked, is there a naming difference between the US and the UK? As far as I know, all of the fixtures are named the same thing. You get to just choose what plug and yoke you want. So like US standard obviously is what we would use here, but I believe that you would then just go for the correct power plug that you would use for that. But I believe that the naming hierarchy is the exact same. So that is the 1x1 hard, the 1x1 soft, and the 2x1 soft. We used all of these different fixtures in a bunch of different ways, but by modifying the lights, we were able to do things like control spill, adjust the output, change the behavior to stop those lights down and make them softer, or use things like barn doors to redirect them. The nice thing with this light panel series is that all of the modifiers are made for all of the light configurations, which means you can get them for the 2x1s, you can get them for the 1x1s, you can get them for the dual array, both for the 1x1 and the 2x1. And they also make a quad array, which is insane. I've used it. It's wild, where you can actually stack 4 fixtures into a configuration together. And they also make modifiers for those. So if you want on-light modifiers, you can get a whole host of them depending on what you want to do. And then, of course, any off-light modifiers like the butterfly that we used. It's insane, the versatility that you have. Now, the other thing that I wanted to note is that our on-stage lighting that we used, right? The way that we lit our person, and I'll pull them up over here. So we come back over here, right? So you can see here that on the left, we have all of this beautiful key, but you can see across the rim of the chair, we're using our hair light, which is separating our subject from the background. And then we're filling in, not losing the contrast, because we wanted this to be super moody, but we're filling in on camera right, just some of that contrast across the bridge of the nose and in that eye socket there and kind of underneath the chin there, just to fill in a little bit of those gaps there. But in the way that we actually set up the lights for this is that we had the background light set to warm tungsten, like 2700 Kelvin. And then we had the spotlight or our hair light also set to that warm 2700 Kelvin. But what we then did is for the key light, we set those to daylight, which is 5600 Kelvin. And then we white balanced our footage to that 5600 Kelvin, which allowed our skin tones to feel very, very natural, but then took the tungsten lights that we had in the rest and made that super, super warm, right? Because anytime we adjust our white balance to one side of the CCT spectrum to the other, the far end then, of course, goes extreme. So this would be a mixed lighting setup. You don't always have to do a mixed lighting setup, but again, let your story dictate, do we have fixture control here, right? And if we don't have fixture control, what is the lighting that's already in the space? And how do we then match our lighting to that lighting? Or how do we adjust and contrast that in a mixed lighting setup? But all of this is dictated by story. The story should dictate where you shoot. It should dictate the location. It should dictate the camera work or the camera angles, and it should dictate the lighting. Story is always king. And while your audience isn't going to intrinsically say, hey, it was a great thing that they decided to film the A-roll in these locations and then adjust the lighting instead of being a 2 stops contrast to 4 stops contrast, because it makes it, they're not going to know any of that. But they are going to understand the perceived value in what's being brought to the table if you think through all of those layers, right? Filmmaking is a lasagna. It's a whole bunch of small layers that all contribute to the final thing. And if we're not constantly thinking through each of those layers, something within that mix is going to kind of fall to the wayside. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. I've never had this much G&E on an interview shoot or this much room to shoot. I need to get some better clients. Greg, yes, you need to get better clients. Everybody needs to get better clients. There's a funny phrase in kind of the filmmaking world of like your, $500 clients take forever to pay you and your $15,000 clients pay you right away. And the same is true in terms of edit revisions, quality control, all of that stuff. But this is, again, the value of a walkthrough. So when I have a first meeting with a potential client and they want to know kind of the process and how we do stuff and whatever, I talk about the location scout as just being part of the process. It's not optional. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through your space. We're going to identify the best place to film this, and that's then where we're going to shoot. You make that part of the process. Because people who are hiring you because you are what would be considered the resident expert. You know what you're doing. And most of the time, clients, at least decent ones, will defer to you in what would make them look best. So by explaining to them large locations make a big difference, understanding that how locations help sell their product or their service or their messaging or that story, helping them understand from kind of a final results perspective is going to help a lot in selling your ability to choose where you film. Brian says, may have missed this, but is there a reason to put the edge light on the key side and not the short side? Brian, great question. So again, everything being dictated by story is going to determine which side you place things on. So we actually had the overhead directly behind our subject, which you can kind of see here a little bit on both camera left and camera right. Those shoulders are equally illuminated. And the top of the head, we're a little bit to camera left, but by and large, we're pretty head on from behind them. But again, that's entirely dictated by the story. So for me, I'm totally fine with the backlight being key side because I really wanted to lean in that heavy contrast between my shadow side and my light side, as well as the contrast between my foreground and my background. So by having everything pushed to one side and then just slightly filling it in really adds to that depth and that contrast, just like having the background being super dark compared to my foreground works for this theatrical Lin-Manuel Miranda interview-esque thing that we're doing here. Okay, let's see here. Do you think that there is some truth behind using 3200 backlight when shooting daylight as opposed to 5600 when shooting tungsten? Yeah, it depends. I mean, if you're shooting mixed lighting, in my opinion, daylight should always be on the skin tones and your warm should always be coming from behind. It is okay for skin to become warmer or feel warmer, and that's fine, right? Because if we're shooting with our key set to daylight and we have our camera set to daylight, our skin tones are going to seem natural. Then by having warm coming from behind, it's okay if it warms it up. That's fine. What you don't want is to cool it down. Because of course, everybody has natural reds, oranges, and yellows in their skin tone, no matter, what their pigmentation is. Warm is fine. Cooling that off is where things start to feel more like an interrogation and not an interview, right? So playing with light and playing with color is important, but always feel free to warm skin up. Be very careful with how we would then cool it off. Let's see here, naming diffusions and modifiers. I am not entirely sure about the UK market in terms of modifiers and diffusion. I believe that the products technically all would have the same name. That said, of course, in filmmaking, especially when you start getting into the larger scopes of stuff, a lot more lingo and jargon and verbiage gets used. So I don't know if the film jargon in the UK is different than it is here in the US, but I believe that product names specifically are going to be the same. So things like magic cloth, artificial silks, butterflies, all of that stuff, that naming structure should be the same, even if people colloquially call it something different. Okay, can you please explain how you mounted the 1x1 soft on the boom? Absolutely, I would be happy to. So let's take a look at this here. In this freeze frame here, you can see here that I have a booming combo stand. It's a single stand that has a right angle arm that comes off of it, which just has a baby pin, which is a standard light mount post or a mount size. You can kind of see right underneath that Litepanels logo there where that pin is. So the combo stand, having the baby pin right off the top, allows me to slide that light directly onto that stand. And of course, because that light is so bright, I'm then able to run that just with a sandbag off of the backside of the boom and not have to use something like a menace arm or scaffolding or other larger rigging that you would have to use if you were using heavier fixtures. So any booming stand that has a baby pin is going to be able to take that light no problem, because that's your 5/8, that's your standard kind of light stand pin. Combo stands are different than light stands in that generally combo stands work on a junior pin, which is what the 2x1 Gemini takes, which is a much thicker post. But your 1x1s and most of your LED fixtures and modifiers and things work on baby pins, which is going to be your general light stands. C stands all run on the baby pin size. And a lot of combo stands, especially the Avenger combo stands, have the baby pin mounts off the top of them there. Okay. Let's see here. If you want to simulate light from outside a window, a backlight, could be daylight, as you said, it depends on location. Yeah. So, Arnaud, to that point, if we were shooting in an environment that had lighting already there, right? So windows, we don't have control over the windows. We don't want to necessarily black those windows out. We can then use those lights to dictate how we would then light, both in terms of temperature and in terms of behavior, right? So you can film in any location that you want. And this is one of the values of having a spectrometer or a color meter, is because I can take a color meter read of any lighting fixture in my environment, and I can perfectly match the light panels to that environment. So especially if you're shooting corporate stuff, there's a lot of times where you're not gonna have light control, like fixture control, where you're able to like adjust those things. And so being able to match to those things is going to make skin tones and skin rendition as good as humanly possible. Where people start to look sickly and gross is like, for instance, if we're shooting an environment that has fluorescent light, because fluorescent light is disgusting, and then trying to just do a daylight to tungsten thing to where then you're white balancing for daylight, but then the house lights are all this green tint, and then it makes people look really disgusting. But if I'm able to perfectly match my fixtures to the existing lighting, I can then white balance for that and make those skin tones look as good as possible. And making skin tone look good is 85% of the battle in, you know, people having confidence that they look good on camera. Because if they look sick, like they just got off a roller coaster, we're in for a bad time. All right, Cal says, any particular advice or tips when lighting people with darker skin tones? Yeah, so you would obviously need to adjust your lighting from a lighter complexion to a darker complexion, but the principles are all entirely the same. Now, everyone who is in this film industry needs to be using monitors. On-camera monitors, off-camera monitors, doesn't matter. Don't trust the monitor on the back of your camera. This is why RE cameras don't have monitors, right? Most RED cameras don't have monitors. You get monitors that you then use, and they serve a very, very specific purpose. To understand how we would want to adjust our lighting using false color, which is an exposure assist within your monitors, like small HD monitors have fantastic false color built in. And false color kind of looks like predator vision, where everything kind of turns into a rainbow. But each of the colors in that rainbow visual represents a different exposure value. And generally skin tones, you want to kind of be in that 60 to 65 IRE on a scale of 1 to 100. So if I was lighting somebody in the chair of a darker complexion, what I would do is I would use false color to help me determine when the skin tone is reaching that 60 to 65 IRE, so that way I know the exposure on their face is exactly what I want. And from there, I can then adjust my environment lights again to help compensate and make sure that I have that kind of contrast ratio that we were talking about earlier. But if you're not adjusting your lights and you're interviewing multiple people, and some people have lighter complexions and some people have darker complexions, some people are going to be underexposed. Some people are going to be overexposed. And it's not going to give you the quality or that end result that you really want. And this is where false color is a fantastic exposure assist tool to help make sure that you're dialing all that in. Okay, let's see here. How long did it take to move the lights from their single mounts to the double mount? Kelly, great question. Cool. All right, so we're wrapping this up in about 10 minutes. So let's get a couple more questions in here. If you guys want questions answered, pop those in. We're going to start wrapping this thing up here. So, but Kelly says, how long did it take to move the lights from their single mount to their double mount? Great question. The 1x1 dual array is so unbelievably simple. All you need is a hex key, right? Or like a little hex branch. I think in total, from start to finish, it probably took 5 minutes, maybe. Really, really easy. It's a super simple setup. It's super easy to lock them in, get them behaving together. In those dual arrays, again, those will work on a junior pin versus a baby pin. So you're going to want to make sure that you have a nice hardy stand that has a junior pin receiver on it. But it is super, super easy. It's quite amazing here. Okay. Has the arrival and success of logs, S-Log mainly, changed the way that you would light a scene? So any of the Sony logs and Sony cameras in general, you know, we work on kind of exposing to the right, where our highlights are the things that we have, you know, the best recovery on. It hasn't necessarily changed the way that I light, only because, I mean, shooting in log is very similar to shooting in raw, which is going to give me a ton more latitude in post. So if you're working with a camera that shoots in a true log, right? So Panasonic has V-Log, Canon has C-Log, Sony has S-Log, Fuji has, I think it's called X-Log. If you're shooting in a true log, you're going to get a lot more dynamic range, which means that we can play with those contrast ratios a lot more freely than we could if we were shooting with a camera that only was shooting in standard, right? Or some color profile like that. So in that way, yeah, you could be more extreme with how you light, but the functions of how we go about lighting haven't really changed that much, especially because I try as hard as I can to keep my camera settings stable, meaning I'm shooting with a native ISO, I'm shooting at a shutter speed of double my frame rate or 180-degree angle. My frame rate's always the same. My f-stop is usually between 4 to 5, 6. So my camera settings don't change that much. It's the way that I light to make sure that I adjust for that exposure. That's the thing that I change. Let's see here. Sharon says, with a 2-person interview, do you adjust to darker person or to lighter person? So that's going to depend on your camera, Sharon. So for instance, going back to what Matthew was saying earlier, with S-Log cameras, something that has better highlight recovery, I would make sure that I would set my exposure to a darker complexion, because I'm going to know that I'm going to be able to pull that down better than I am going to bring that up. Whereas something like Canon, shooting in like a C-Log, you're going to have better shadow recovery than you are in highlight recovery. But in general, what I would do if I am shooting with a camera that has a decent latitude, right, or a decent dynamic range, I would kind of aim for the middle, right? So I would aim for the middle between the two, so that I'm going a little bit up and a little bit down, depending on those complexions, and adjust accordingly. And then make sure that I have cameras that would be single shots, you know, hero single shots that are exposed properly for each of those people. Okay, so as we kind of wrap this up here, there are more questions that I'm probably not going to be able to get everybody in here. So as we move forward, again, this is the first of many. We're going to be doing things about how to light nighttime exteriors, how to light the interiors of cars. We're going to get into some really, really cool stuff through this. Litepanels has the web page here that has this one as well as all future events. So make sure that you're plugged into that, because this one is probably the simplest of the ones that we're looking at, and we're just going to get real wild from here. If you have suggestions of other things that you want to learn how to light and learn how to move and go through and do, please comment them. Get in touch with us. Get in touch with me. Follow me on Instagram. My Instagram is just my name, which is Garrett Sammons. I can throw it here in the chat here to everyone. I'm pretty active on Instagram, so this would be where you would get in touch with me the best. Feel free to DM me with any further questions that you have. So I'm going to answer one or two more, and then we're going to wrap it up for the day. Sarah says, is RGB necessary, or could you recreate this with a bicolor only fixture to save on budget? Sarah, fantastic question. So the Geminis are full RGB WW lights, meaning that we have full color spectrum control. Litepanels also makes a series of fixtures called Astras, and the Astras are equally intense in terms of light behavior and output, but they are far more cost effective because they are bicolor lights. Some of them are bifocus lights, but bicolor lights. You can do a ton with bicolor lights. And especially if you're just working on building out your kit, this goes back to the brightest lights that are the most accurate lights that your budget can afford, right? And if the Astra line is where you are and where you start, fantastic. Those are unbelievable lights. The only things to consider with those lights is that you don't have that color offset or tint control. So while you do have the warm to cool light within our CCT table, you then don't have the vertical where you can adjust for green to magenta. So things like fluorescent lights would probably still be a little bit troublesome to deal with. You could get pretty close, but no, bicolor lights can get you super, super far. And especially when we're talking about interview stuff like this, you don't necessarily need all of those colors and color options available to you. So Astra lights, fantastic lights. Again, you can find those on the Litepanels website. I have a host of them. I love them. The Gemini lights just give you a little bit more specificity in how you control those. Okay, how would you light a 3-person panel conversation against a big window with a city skyline? Holy cats, you're going to need a lot of light. So if you're using windows as the background, you are now competing with the sun. So this would be things like where you would use the 2x1 light panels in like a quad configuration to make it like a 4 foot by 2 foot fixture. And you'd probably use 2 of those to really harness that super, super bright light. Generally, I will avoid windows as best I can, or I'll scrim windows. We talked about scrims a little earlier, which is kind of like little screen meshes where you can stop down the amount of light in a window without necessarily making it like completely opaque. So it would be a combination of things. But in general, with 3 people, same principles apply. You're going to need larger modifiers. So like that 12 foot would be perfect for that because you want to make sure that that surface area behaves really well. You might have to do individual hair lights to make sure that you separate all 3 of them, and possibly do the same with fills. But big surface areas in contrast to our subjects. That's the key here when we want really nice, soft light. Brennan asks if this shirt is mustard or orange. I don't know, take your pick. It's like a stone ground brown mustard, I guess would be the technical term. But when you run a company called Nice Shirt Media, you have to make sure that you have some nice shirts here. So again, if I didn't get to your questions, DM me on Instagram, follow me there. And again, we're doing more of these. There's going to be 12 of these throughout the year. They're all going to get cooler and crazier as we go on. If you have suggestions of things that you want to see, let me know. We've got a bunch of these planned. So this is going to be super, super cool. But please stay in touch. Please make sure that you're subscribed to this whole thing so that way you know when the next ones of these come around here. There is an email going out tomorrow of this recording. So then if you want to go back through and hear some of the stuff that we talked about, you're going to have access to that. So feel free to kind of review those. And if you have more questions, bring them. And also, I love questions. So whether it's this session, next session, or any time in between, please feel free to reach out. I would love to kind of get in touch with you guys. This is going to be super, super fun. I'm super excited about it. Thank you to Litepanels for hosting this. And I hope to see you all next time. Thanks.